In 1954, a widow named Margaret Ellis broke her hip in a farmhouse kitchen in rural Ohio, alone, with no phone, and only $40 to her name until the next check arrived. What she did in the 6 months that followed wasn't just survival. It was a quiet system passed down through generations of women who had nothing but knew everything about making it last. Today, that system has almost vanished, but one rule, buried in the last page of her handwritten ledger, explains why she never went hungry, never lost her home, and never lost her spirit either. Stay with us, because rule number 7 changes everything. If forgotten wisdom like this speaks to you, consider subscribing before we begin, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. The morning that started everything. Margaret woke up that first Tuesday alone in a house built for 4 people and felt the silence press against her like a weight. The doctor said her hip would heal, given time. Her daughter, Linda, 3 states away, had offered to fly out, but Margaret had said no, not yet, not until she figured out how to live inside this new, smaller life. She lay in bed for 11 minutes staring at the ceiling before she remembered something her own mother used to say. Get dressed, even for nobody, especially for nobody. It sounded almost foolish at first, a leftover phrase from a harder decade, the kind of thing said by women who ironed pillowcases and starched collars for church on Wednesdays too. But Margaret pushed herself up anyway, wincing, and reached for the blue cardigan hanging on the closet door. She combed her hair. She put on the small gold earrings her late husband had given her in 1961. Nobody was coming to see her that day. That was exactly the point. In the 1950s, women living through hardship, widows, single mothers, women stretching a single paycheck across 6 mouths, treated the morning ritual as an act of quiet defiance against despair. It wasn't vanity, it was armor. Psychologists today would call it behavioral activation, a way of signaling to your own brain that today still matters, that you still matter, even when no one is watching. Margaret didn't know the clinical term. She just knew that the woman in the cardigan and earrings felt like someone who could handle a broken hip. The woman in yesterday's nightgown did not. And so, before she'd even made coffee, before she'd even opened the curtains, Margaret had already won the first small battle of the day. The modern translation of this habit is simple. Even if your day holds no visitors, no appointments, and no reason to leave the house, treat your first 20 minutes awake as a ritual, not a routine. Wash your face. Put on real clothes. Make your bed like someone is coming to inspect it. This isn't about performing for others. It's about performing for yourself, so that depression and isolation never get the first word in your day. But the dressing was only the surface. What Margaret did next in that kitchen would matter far more to her survival than anyone could have guessed. The kitchen that remembered her body. Margaret's kitchen had been designed, quite literally, around a woman's exhaustion. In the 1950s, home economists studied something called the kitchen work triangle, the invisible path between stove, sink, and refrigerator that a woman walked hundreds of times a day. But what almost nobody talks about now is what women did inside that triangle once their bodies started failing them. With her hip barely healed, Margaret couldn't afford to cross her kitchen 15 times to make a single pot of tea. So she built what her grandmother once called a sitting station, a low table pulled beside her one good chair, holding salt, her most used spices, a spoon, a paring knife, and a single mixing bowl. Everything she needed for 80% of her meals lived within arm's reach of where she sat. It looked strange, almost improvised, like a nurse's tray in a hospital room. but it meant Margaret could cook an entire meal without standing more than 3 times. This wasn't laziness, it was energy conservation, decades before the term became fashionable in physical therapy offices. Women recovering from childbirth, from illness, from the simple brutal exhaustion of raising 5 children on one income, built these stations instinctively because there was no one coming to help them and no time to waste on wasted steps. The modern translation is almost embarrassingly simple, and that's exactly why it works. If you live with mobility limits, arthritis, or the aftermath of a fracture, build your own sitting station today. A small rolling cart or a tray table beside your favorite chair, stocked with your 5 most used items. It sounds small. It is not small. For Margaret, it was the difference between cooking for herself and giving up and ordering the same 3 frozen dinners on rotation until her daughter finally insisted she move into assisted living. She wasn't ready for that. Not yet. And so, day by day, her sitting station kept her independent a little longer. But independence, Margaret would soon discover, required more than clever furniture arrangement. It required something to do with her hands when the silence in the house grew too loud to bear. The basket of broken things. On the 3rd day, Margaret found her husband's old flannel shirt in the mending basket, a button missing from the left cuff, exactly where he'd left it before he passed 2 years earlier. She had never thrown the basket away. In the 1950s, nothing was discarded simply because it was broken. A woman named Dorothy from Margaret's old church circle used to say that mending was cheaper than therapy and twice as effective. A missing button meant 15 quiet minutes with a needle, thread, and your own thoughts, not scrolling, not staring at a screen, not spiraling into worry, but the specific, grounding focus of small, repetitive stitches. Margaret sat with that flannel shirt for nearly an hour. She wasn't in a hurry. The repair itself took 4 minutes. The rest of the time, she simply sat in his old chair, holding the shirt, remembering the Sunday he'd worn it to fix the fence, remembering 100 small, ordinary days she hadn't known to treasure while she was living them. This is the part modern frugality videos never mention, that mending isn't just about saving $12 on a replacement shirt. It's about the psychological anchor of tending, of proving to yourself that things and people and even grief can be repaired rather than replaced. Fast fashion has trained an entire generation to discard first and think later. But a woman with a mending basket owns fewer things and loves them more. The modern translation, keep a small basket, thread, needles, a few buttons, fabric glue for the things you won't sew, somewhere visible in your home, not buried in a closet. Mend one small thing this week, even if you could easily buy a replacement. Notice what happens to your mind during those 15 quiet minutes. Margaret noticed something else, too, something she hadn't expected. The mending had made her hungry, not just for food, but for the kind of cooking that required no daily effort at all, because her hip still throbbed by 4 o'clock every afternoon. The pot that cooked for a week. This is where Margaret's ledger revealed something that surprised even her daughter Linda when she finally read it months later. Written in pencil, dated a Sunday afternoon, it simply said, "Big pot today, small work all week." In the 1950s, women without refrigerators the size we have now, without freezers stocked full of pre-made meals, learned to cook in a single, deliberate act of foresight, rather than a daily scramble. Once a week, usually Sunday, a woman, like Margaret's own mother, would build a stock pot from whatever the week had left behind, a ham bone, the ends of carrots, onion skins boiled for color, a handful of barley. It simmered for hours, filling the house with a smell that meant safety more than it meant food. From that single pot came 4, 5, sometimes 6 meals across the week, a soup on Monday, a stew thickened on Wednesday, a broth for rice on Friday. The genius of this system wasn't the recipe, it was the timing. It meant that on the days a woman felt too exhausted, too heartbroken, too simply human to cook, dinner was already halfway finished, waiting in the icebox, needing only to be reheated. Margaret made her own version that Sunday, sitting on a stool by the stove because standing too long still hurt, dropping in the leftover chicken bones from Thursday, a bruised onion, 3 carrots gone soft in the drawer. She didn't measure anything. She simply let it cook while she sat in the next room with her mending basket. And something about hearing that pot bubble away made the house feel less empty than it had in days. The modern translation is one that budgeting experts rarely frame emotionally, though they should. Batch cooking isn't primarily about money, though it saves plenty. It's about protecting your future self on the day she'll have nothing left to give. Cook once, portion it, freeze what you won't eat within 3 days. On your hardest afternoon this week, you'll thank the version of yourself who stood at the stove on Sunday. But even a full freezer couldn't protect Margaret from every danger in that old house. And what she discovered next was something that could have cost her far more than money. The rug she finally threw away. It happened on a Thursday, nearly 2 weeks after the fall that had started all of this. Margaret was crossing from the kitchen to the hallway, tray in hand, when her slipper caught the curled edge of the hallway runner, the same faded rug that had sat in that spot since 1968. She didn't fall. She caught herself against the wall, heart pounding, tray clattering to the floor, and stood there for a full minute, simply breathing. That evening, for the first time since her husband passed, Margaret rolled up that rug herself, dragged it to the garage, and left it there. She thought about the homes of her childhood and how her own grandmother's farmhouse had almost no rugs at all, no clutter along the walking paths, nothing but bare, swept floorboards between one room and the next. It wasn't minimalism as a design trend, it was survival architecture, built by women who understood that a broken hip in 1951 could mean the end of independence entirely, decades before hospitals had the tools we have now. Furniture was pushed against walls, not scattered through open floor space. Cords were never left crossing a doorway. Nightlights burned in hallways long before anyone called it fallproofing. This habit matters more today than perhaps any other on this list, because for a senior living alone, a single fall can change everything: independence, confidence, even life expectancy. The modern translation is uncomfortable but necessary. Walk through your own home tonight as though you were a stranger checking it for hazards. Remove rugs that curl or slide. Clear the path between your bed and bathroom completely. Add a nightlight where you least expect to need one. Margaret's mother never had a name for this practice. She simply called it keeping the way clear, and it may be the single most important sentence in this entire video. But clearing the physical path was only half the work. The other kind of loneliness, the kind that lives in silence rather than in cluttered hallways, required a different solution entirely, and it was waiting for Margaret in a box she hadn't opened in over a year. The letters she never sent. In the back of her closet, behind winter coats she no longer wore, Margaret found a shoebox of stationery. Cream-colored paper, a few stamps gone slightly yellow at the edges, and a fountain pen her sister Patricia had given her for her 50th birthday. Before telephones sat in every American pocket, before video calls and text messages, women wrote letters, and something about a letter carried weight that a phone call never quite matched. It couldn't be interrupted. It couldn't be rushed. It required the writer to slow down and choose her words with the same deliberate care she once used mending a cuff or seasoning a stock pot. Margaret sat down that evening and wrote 3 short letters, one to Patricia, one to an old neighbor named Susan who'd moved to Florida years back, and one, almost on impulse, to her own daughter Linda, even though they spoke on the phone every Sunday. She wrote about the fall. She wrote about the mending basket. She wrote, almost shyly, that she was proud of how she'd managed these past 2 weeks. 3 days later, Patricia's reply arrived, 4 handwritten pages, filled with memories neither woman had spoken of in years. Something about seeing her sister's handwriting on the page, rather than hearing her voice through a speaker, made Margaret feel less like a woman recovering alone and more like a woman surrounded, even from 3 states away. Researchers studying loneliness in older adults have found that the specific, tangible nature of a handwritten letter, something you can hold, reread, and keep, creates a deeper sense of connection than a phone call that vanishes the moment it ends. The modern translation doesn't require abandoning your phone. It simply means adding 1 handwritten note a week to whatever else you're already doing. To an old friend, a distant grandchild, even a neighbor you've been meaning to thank. Keep the stationery somewhere visible, the way Margaret now kept hers on the kitchen table, instead of buried in a closet. It costs less than a stamp's worth of money and considerably more than a stamp's worth of comfort. But there was one more page in Margaret's ledger, tucked at the very back, that Linda wouldn't discover until months later. And it was this page, more than any recipe or rule, that explained how her mother had truly survived. The 3 lines that changed everything. At the back of the ledger, past the grocery totals and the mending notes and the stockpot recipes, Margaret had started something new the very night of her fall, and she never stopped it for the rest of that year. 3 lines written every single night before turning off the lamp. Not goals, not to-do lists, simply 3 small things that had gone right that day. The first night, exhausted and in pain, she'd written, "The soup was good. Patricia called. I got dressed even though nobody saw." It seemed almost too small to matter. But in the 1950s, gratitude wasn't treated as a modern wellness trend. It was treated as a survival tool, quietly practiced by women who had genuinely little to be grateful for on paper. Women who lived through the Depression and a world war and understood in their bones that hope had to be chosen nightly because it rarely arrived on its own. This is the habit Margaret's daughter Linda now credits, more than any other, for the version of her mother who emerged from that difficult year. Not a woman diminished by a broken hip, but a woman who had quietly proven to herself, 3 lines at a time, that a broken body does not mean a broken spirit. By the time Margaret's hip had fully healed, she had filled 11 pages with these 3-line entries, and reading back through them felt less like reviewing a hard year and more like discovering evidence of her own resilience, written in her own hand, impossible to argue with. The modern translation is the simplest instruction in this entire video, and perhaps the most important. Before you turn off your own lamp tonight, write down 3 small things that went right today. Keep them in the same notebook week after week, so that on your hardest nights you can open to any page and find proof, written by you, for you, that you have gotten through hard days before, and you will get through this one too. Margaret Ellis never became famous. She never wrote a book or gave a speech about resilience. She simply healed, quietly, in a farmhouse kitchen, using habits her own mother had taught her, without ever calling them a system at all. What she left behind, in a pencil-marked ledger her daughter still keeps in a kitchen drawer today, wasn't a record of money saved, though there was plenty of that, too. It was a record of a woman who refused to let a hard season shrink her spirit. One dressed morning, one mended cuff, one shared pot of soup, one handwritten letter, and 3 honest lines at a time. So here's the question we'll leave you with tonight. Do you think a generation raised on convenience and instant gratification could rebuild that kind of quiet resilience? Or has something been lost along the way that no app or subscription service can ever replace? If this story reminded you of your own mother, grandmother, or perhaps even yourself, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if forgotten wisdom like Margaret's is something you want more of, consider subscribing so the next lost lesson finds its way to you, too.